Good evening. Welcome back to the Open Classroom, where this semester we've been discussing at great depth many of the issues that enter into community engaged work and all of the ethical implications that attach to that. Tonight we have a particularly interesting discussion ahead. I would have us move right into that with a reminder that if you have questions, we encourage you to post those in the Q&A box. And if you have comments, you can send those to us through the chat box. And with that, my name is Ted Lansmark, and I'm director of the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy. And with that introduction, I will turn the screen over to my colleague, Rebecca Riccio. Rebecca, you're on.
Thank you, Ted, and welcome everyone again to another week of the Open Classroom. I would like to start by thanking our participants tonight for the courage and vulnerability to address our topic, which is teaching to transgress, transforming rape culture in the classroom and the community. It is my enormous pleasure to welcome my colleague and friend, Dr. Régine Michel-Jean-Charles, the Director of Africana Studies, Dean's Professor of Culture and Social Justice, and Professor of Africana Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. The breadth of her scholarship and teaching at Northeastern is a reflection of the intellect that she brings, the enormous curiosity and thoughtfulness she brings to our community and the work that she does. Thank you so much, Régine. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Unmute myself. Hi, thank you so much, everyone, for the introduction. Thank you for this opportunity to participate in the Open Classroom. I really love the Open Classroom. I've only been at Northeastern since July, and the Open Classroom has quickly become one of my favorite programs because I really do believe in the concept of an open classroom. I believe that classrooms are to exist as spaces of discovery and learning and possibility, and even, as Bell Hooks says, spaces of freedom that should be open in every sense. And so in my mind, a university classroom must be open. It must be open to the community. It must be open to the public. And it also must invite openness to learning, to thinking, to stretching, to challenging our beliefs and challenging our preconceived notions of what the world is supposed to be, was supposed to look like. So it's in that spirit that when I was invited by Ted and Rebecca to participate, I said, I would like to take the month of April, and I would like to use it as an opportunity to shine a light on a topic that is very important to me, which is the movement to end gender-based violence, because April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And I want to begin this with something that I call survivor acknowledgement. And this is an acknowledgement of the fact that when you consider the statistics, on college campuses, 1 in 5 women will be sexually assaulted. In the world, 1 in 3 women has experienced sexual violence. And of course, we know that there are other statistics that for women and boys, for boys and men, for transgender people, for gender nonconforming people. But these are the statistics that I want us to begin with, the 1 in 5 and the 1 in 3. So because it's 1 in 5 on a college campus, and even though we're virtual, we're technically a college campus, and because it's 1 in 3 in the world globally, that means that ostensibly one of us either has experienced this ourselves or knows someone, a friend, a loved one, a sibling, a parent, someone that we are close to, a child maybe, or we ourselves have experienced sexual violence. And so I want to acknowledge that and hold that number, because that means that we don't know who's in the screen, who's in the webinar with us. But this is a very difficult topic. It is a topic that I believe is also a scourge on our society. It's a human rights issue. It's a social justice issue. And it is an issue that is personal for so many of us. I'm so grateful for the work of survivor advocates and activists who have been amplifying this problem and who are really taking the lead on helping us to imagine a world without sexual violence, and who are even sharing their stories of sexual violence in order to shed more light on this issue. And I can say that from when I have become involved in this movement, when I was, I'll say it was about 22 years ago when I was starting out as a graduate student at Harvard in the year 2000. Since I have become involved, so much has changed in terms of how many more voices we have at the table that are talking about this. I'm so indebted to people like Tarana Burke in the Me Too movement. I am indebted to people like Salamisha Tillett of A Long Walk Home. I'm indebted to people like Anita Hill, who was even willing to talk about sexual harassment on a public screen for which she was excoriated in the 1990s. And so there are many more voices at the table now, which doesn't necessarily make the conversation any less challenging, but it certainly makes it more expansive. And so I hope that in the spirit of an open classroom, we will come with open minds and open hearts as we share about this topic this evening. I also want to point you to the resources that are available specifically for people at Northeastern. The Sexual Assault Resource Center. And as well, if you're in the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center is a great resource. And lastly, RAINN, R-A-I-N-N, which is the national hotline for sexual assault. So I will proceed by doing a couple of things. First, I'm going to give a little overview of what Sexual Assault Awareness Month is, for those of you who don't know. And then I will talk a little bit about a class that I had the opportunity to teach before I came to Northeastern, and which I fully plan to reinvigorate at Northeastern, just haven't figured out exactly how yet, which is a class about transforming rape culture. And that's where the title of this talk comes from, the title of our session comes from. And then I'll introduce our three panelists who are joining us and will add their expertise to the topic. So Sexual Assault Awareness Month is an opportunity to promote education of sexual violence. This month traces its history to the 1970s, when activists first began organizing on a national scale to reduce the number of the percentages of sexual assault and violence against women. Advocates have fought to bring the topic that was once taboo into public discussion, out of the shadows and into the lights. Many of you might recall, for example, Take Back the Night, which were some events that took place. Those also started in the 1970s. And these were times where women would have these big rallies in the night and share their stories about sexual violence with the public. The first rape crisis center in the United States was the Bay Area Women Against Rape. It opened in 1971, and their goals were to provide counseling and advocacy for survivors, as well as to educate the community. So one thing you'll notice as we talk throughout the night, that this idea of community engagement and bringing this to the community really run through all of the different aspects of this movement. So their work paved the way for more coalitions like Take Back the Night, which started in 1976, and increased the visibility of this issue. By the 1980s, the National Coalition Against Sexual Assault was mobilizing groups around the country to take action at higher levels. And in 1994, after a long campaign, Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act, also known as VAWA, the first legislation to require law enforcement to treat domestic violence as crime and not a private matter. And I just want to say a word about definitions. So sexual violence is an umbrella term that encompasses rape, incest, sexual assault, street harassment, domestic violence, right? So that's the umbrella term, right? We could use actually gender-based violence, right, as the umbrella term. And what I love about the term gender-based violence is that it acknowledges that this is not only harm that is occurring against women, right? But that it acknowledges that the mindset of gender-based violence is one in which our investments in white supremacist heteropatriarchy are often the result of this violence that's meted against trans people, that's meted against non-binary people, that's meted against children, women, and girls, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's my word about definitions. Now, next, I'm going to just quickly talk about the inspiration for the title. So as I said, we took our title, Teaching to Transgress, Transforming a Rape Culture on Campus and in Communities, or in the classroom and in communities. And this is a title, of course, that is inspired by the late Black feminist scholar, thinker, activist, and trailblazer Bell Hooks, who has a book called Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom. And I was just looking to see if I have it there, but I think it's not there. Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom. In it, she argues that the classroom can become a space of possibility, that the classroom is a place where we as professors must bring our whole selves and invite all of our students to be on equal footing to participate in dialogue. And this is really a pedagogy that I espouse as a teacher and that I've really been able to implement in all of my teaching. And so when I taught this class, which I co-taught with a dear friend who's a sociologist, Sean McGuffey, who has also done a lot of work in the movement to end gender-based violence as both a scholar and an activist. When I taught this, I started teaching this class, and the class was called Where Hashtag Black Lives Matter Meets Hashtag Me Too. And we taught this class, well, originally the title of the class was Transforming Rape Culture, but unfortunately the administration told us that that title was too radical and it was too scary. So we couldn't put rape culture in the title. And so we changed the title to Where Hashtag Black Lives Matter Meets Hashtag Me Too. And we chose those two movements because we wanted to show how, where, and why racial violence and sexual violence intersect. So we really focused on violence and representation in the African diaspora. We read novels and poetry. We watched films, all by authors throughout the African diaspora and by artists throughout the African diaspora that address the topic of rape culture. We also, on the sociology side, read a lot of sociological essays and studies about how the issue of rape culture can be studied in ways that are qualitative and quantitative. And it was truly an interdisciplinary effort. It was also, I always say, an effort birthed in love, because my colleague and I are also dear friends, but people who truly believe in a world without sexual violence and truly believe that this generation can be equipped to end it. And we invite our students to imagine a world without sexual violence. And one of the things that we have them do is to create these projects. And in their projects, they have to, literally, the assignment is imagining a world without sexual violence. And for some of them, they're placed in a lab with a community organization, the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center. We also worked with Violence in Boston, which is the Black Lives Matter movement in Boston. We also worked with the Haitian Women's Association of Boston. And then we had students who do a survey, and they're more on the quantitative side, and they do a campus climate survey about sexual violence on campus. And then we have another lab for which the students have to create something visual, so some sort of visual art or performance piece. And they actually made this beautiful, beautiful mural that featured the quote unquote leaders, or I would say the originators, because really we believe in a non-hierarchical vision of leadership, but the visionaries behind the Black Lives Matter movement, Opal Tometi, Alicia Garza, and Patrisse Cullors, alongside Tarana Burke, the visionary behind the Me Too movement. And so that was what happened in the last time that we taught the class. But we take this title, Transforming Rape Culture, from a very important book that came out in the early 2000s called Transforming a Rape Culture. And I want to read just one quote from that book, because I think it helps you to understand what the vision was behind our class. Transforming a rape culture involves imaginative leaps from our present state of institutionalized violence to a future that is safer and more just. We must summon our imagination for this task because history and society have so few precedents for us. Transforming a rape culture is about changing fundamental attitudes and values. We took this very seriously. We wanted our students to summon their imaginations to transform rape culture. And although, as they say in the book, we have so few precedents for us, we do believe that the students leave our classroom after they've done this work with the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, or they've done the work with Violence in Boston, or they've learned about the incidents of sexual violence in our world, or they've read texts and watched films that try to imagine different worlds. We really do believe that that they leave this classroom with ideas about how to go about that work. So now I'm going to begin introducing my panelists, our panelists. And I will start in alphabetical order with Casey. Casey Corcoran is the Youth Sexual Violence Prevention Education Director at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center. And again, the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1973, and it's the only comprehensive rape crisis center in the greater Boston area and the oldest and the largest of its kind in New England. The mission of BARCC, BARCC, is to end sexual violence through healing and social change. And Casey will be our representative from the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center. After Casey, we are going to have Berlindine Elie, who is a graduate of Boston College, where she graduated from in 2021 with a major in Africana Studies and a minor in philosophy. Originally from New Jersey, Bibi is the child of Haitian immigrants and a passionate social justice advocate. In 2018, when we taught this class for the first time, she was one of the first people to sign up as our TA, because the class that, as we taught it, was only available to first year students. And so she was one of our TAs for the class. And Bibi is currently a first-year law student at Boston College. And last, we have Kate Kemp, who is a sophomore at Boston College, majoring in history and English and minoring in women, gender, and sexuality studies. She was a student in the BLM to Me Too class as a freshman in 2020, and was one of the 4 in the BARCC lab that created a 3-lesson presentation on the history of sexual violence and racial discrimination. This lab group presented a lesson to BARCC's YLC group, which is the group that Casey's with now, of high schoolers engaged in discussions about rape culture and their perspective as high school students. So thank you again to each of you for joining us. And I will give you each a moment to share before I start to ask you some questions. So Casey, why don't you lead us off?
Sure. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate being asked to be here on behalf of BARCC. As was said, my name is Casey Corcoran. I use he, him, his pronouns. And on top of leading the youth violence prevention work at BARCC, I oversee all of the prevention outreach and education work. BARCC is a multi-service agency, and we were so happy to be working on this partnership in this amazing class, really creating some powerful and impactful tools for our YLC, which is our Youth Leadership Corps, to utilize. We offer free and confidential services to everybody in the greater Boston area, from our counseling services to our 24-hour hotline to medical advocacy to prevention and outreach education. So we are here as a community partner to you all and want to be of service. And I'm just happy to be invited to be part of this conversation with these other 2 fantastic panelists.
Thank you so much. Bibi, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you for holding this space during this important month. These conversations are definitely needed, so I'm just happy to be here as well. As mentioned, I was one of the first TAs for the amazing class. I know we're going to talk more about it, but I will say that class completely changed the culture of Boston College for the better. It was astounding. It was amazing. It was such an honor I took a similar version of the class previously, but not the same exact class. So it was just an honor to be a TA and to be able to provide mentorship to the students. And yeah, till this day, that class has stuck with me, and the students have definitely stuck with me as well.
Go ahead, Kate.
Hi, so as Professor Jean Charles said, I was a freshman in 2020 taking the BLM class. And as Bibi said, it was life-changing. And there was such a community in the class, I'm living with one of the girls I met in it. And what I loved about my BARCC group and just the class in general, it was the type of class where you can't just learn these things in the classroom and then continue as you were. You have to engage with the community and then take that knowledge and apply it to your life. So I was a classics minor. And then I decided that I didn't really care about classics that much. Sorry to anyone who loves classics, but, and I changed to women and gender and sexuality studies. And that has just transformed like the lens that I study all the fields. So it was a great class.
Thank you so much. And so I'm curious for each of you about, again, as we talked about the movement to end gender-based violence and Sexual Assault Awareness Month in general, but how do each of you enter prior, without kind of talking about the class, but where do you enter into this subject? One of my favorite feminist historians, Paula Gidding, she has a book called When and Where I Enter. And I think that that's such a good framing for thinking about this topic of sexual violence. I can share that for me personally, it was when, I kind of would go to Take Back the Night when I was an undergrad, but it was when I was in graduate school and my friend Salamisha Tillett invited me to act in a multimedia arts performance about Black women and sexual assault. And I was going in as a performer because they knew that I loved to act and I had done For Color Girls and other feminist plays. And I didn't really know what I was getting into, but I auditioned and I got the role. And then this like little performance became a nonprofit organization. And we were like traveling all over the country, doing performances about Black women and sexual assault. And what I learned as I was doing this was the more I would share with people about it, the more people would disclose to me. People would disclose to me that they were rape survivors. And it was people, friends that I went to college with who had never disclosed before. I had family members who had never disclosed before. But because I was doing this work, they would tell me. And me being me, I was like, well, I can't just hold this. Like, I got to figure out how to be equipped to help these people. So I went to the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center while I was in graduate school and went through the training, the 40-hour training, and I was a public educator. And then after that, when I moved to Washington, D.C., I was a hotline counselor. And so that's kind of my story. It was through the arts, really, that I entered into my passion for this topic. But what about the rest of you? Why don't we start with... Can we start with you, Kate? Is that okay?
Sure. So when I was in high school, I'm from the South. I feel like sexual assault and a lot of things weren't discussed, at least in my community. But I explored the topic through a local charity called Thistle Farms, which helps survivors of sexual assault sort of recuperate and grow through art and other types of fields. So when I got to Boston College, I wanted to explore that topic because I really didn't know that much. And obviously through the class, I learned a lot. And then I've just been continuing working in different classes and working with my local community with Thistle Farms to explore that and honestly just learn more because I have a lot to learn and I want to continue this work throughout my life and in whatever career or field I pursue, I want to have this lens to view every subject that I study.
Thanks so much. Casey?
Yeah, it's in asking that question, I'm thinking back, and as I've gotten older, I've been in the field a long time, and I think I discover new places that I've entered this work or this thinking as I've gotten older. I've done the archaeology. The most obvious place is I'm a former DC public schools teacher.
Oh, wow.
Noyes Elementary. And I saw the profound level of violence that impacted my students on a daily basis and how they still came to school and strive to learn and be excellent in everything they did. And I got into the field of violence prevention out of that. I left the classroom and got into violence prevention, youth violence prevention. And then a friend of mine, Dr. Jay Silverman, who was at Harvard and led a gender-based violence prevention center, and his partner, Dr. Anita Raj, also friends, who are both big in these fields, said to me, in 2000, have you ever thought about, I know you do violence prevention, have you ever thought about doing gender-based violence prevention? I said, no, I haven't. And they hooked me up with an organization called Emerge in Cambridge that does battering intervention, in particular, working with individuals who've used violence in their relationship. And that was my entry point. It was not through survivor services. It was through working with individuals who'd used violence, who'd caused harm in leading groups for young men and boys, male identified folks, and adult men in that. And that started me off on on my career and really made me into a preventionist. I've seen so much. I've seen the impact, those stats. I've seen what those stats mean. And that makes me a preventionist because I want to pull this out at the roots and stop it before it actually happens. And that's what I've dedicated my career to.
And Casey, I'm going to stick with you for a little bit longer before I move to BB, but could you just say a little bit more about what it means to be a preventionist? Because I think, I'd imagine maybe your friend, Dr. J, works there, but I remember when I was in graduate school at Harvard, and I also did this training through the Office of Sexual Assault Prevention and Response that Susan Marie started. Yeah. And And that was at the time where this shift was occurring in the field, where instead of talking about, okay, you know, you come to college and they say, okay, here's how to not get raped, right? Watch your drink, make sure your drink is with you at all times, carry mace, you know, and so they're really putting the onus on the potential victims as opposed to on the potential perpetrators. Could you just share a little bit with us about what that means, preventionists, in that evolution?
Yeah, you know, in some ways we moved away from the kind of medical model of prevention of primary, secondary, tertiary prevention, more towards the universal, you know, or indicated prevention, right? Looking at the population level, we're realizing that we need to be changing the culture on campuses so that we're promoting healthy sexuality and healthy relationships. And we're working actively to dismantle systems that allow for and accept sexual violence, both at the interpersonal level and at the community and cultural level. Now, I do a ton of work in colleges, and honestly, I get asked all the time, how do we prevent sexual violence on campus? And I say this without joking. My most frequent answer is, well, we have to work with middle school and elementary school students. You don't practice the fire drill during the fire, right? In the same way that we need to be we need to have robust kindergarten to campus strategies of prevention, not expecting that somebody comes onto campus and does a bystander intervention training and they're good to go, right? This needs to be embedded into the curriculum that all young people get. They need to be facile with the language and the concepts well before they come onto your campus. That's good prevention work. It's going younger, it's starting at the roots, it's making it developmentally appropriate. And that's creating lasting and impactful change. I'll also say for me, prevention is about, I love talking with students and working with students because we need multi-generational leadership around this issue. We can't address this issue effectively without multi-generational leadership. And so many college students and high school students, frankly, in greater Boston, have been leading the way on this issue. And it's just been amazing to watch. And I have been excited to follow their lead.
I love that. Thank you so much. Speaking of a multi-generational leader, BB, what do you have to say?
Yeah, I enter into this conversation, I think, firstly, as a survivor. There's something very special about seeing yourself in the work that you're learning, like going to class and, you know, reading all these texts like throughout your whole entire life, it not ever showing up in the books that you read. It's never being talked about at the dinner table. And so when I got to college and I saw that class the first time, I definitely had to take it. And I remember just going to so many office hours and saying like, oh my gosh, like I experienced that, or, oh my gosh, like, you know, I could like so many things it made so much sense to me and it validated me. And then from there, I wanted to then go and be someone who validates others and be a good bystander. And so, and just also seeing work where Black women is at the center, because I think usually when I'm exploring this topic, I don't see that. And so like I show up in that way as a survivor, and also just growing up seeing like some of the people I love being domestically abusive relationships, and being so young to where I don't really have the power to do anything, and feeling powerless, but then like taking this class and learning the different words, learning how I can support survivors instead of just saying, you know, and put in my judgment. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, BB. And thank you, for your disclosure. I never take that lightly, though I've heard you say it many times. Thank you. Okay, so here at Northeastern, one of the central tenets of how we approach education is this idea of experiential knowledge, right? So Northeastern has this world-known co-op program, but it's even beyond just the co-op. It's something that is of value and that professors are asked to have as a value in our classes. How does this apply to the way that we approach rape culture? So put differently, what is gained in your mind to an approach of studying rape culture or learning about it in the classroom that's also in partnership with community organizations like the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center? And really, any of you can take this question. Maybe we'll just hear from two of you and then we'll go on to the next one.
I can take a stab at this. I think there's a lot to be gained in learning about rape culture in the classroom than also in organizations. It's one thing to learn about something in theory, and it's another thing to learn about it in practice and get that experience and communicate, interact with survivors, and make real life applications, hands-on experiences. Those are two completely different things. And I think I definitely am able to see that now as someone who is in law school. I see a lot of things where a lot of rape cases where it's kind of just handled as a small case. There's an influx of cases, and so it's done quickly. It loses the humanity of it, right? And you don't get to sit in this experience. And it's a really serious matter. It has serious traumatic effects, and it's not something that can be brushed away. It's not something you can just learn and just go about your day. As Kate was saying, it changes your life. And I think you need to have that experiential learning along with the theoretical to really see, to really check yourself, one also, because you might think you're so perfect. And then when you're out on the front lines, you're like, oh my gosh, I have my own biases. I didn't know that about myself. So I think it's very important.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What about you, Kate? How did that experience translate for you? How did doing the lab with the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center kind of inform, enhance, complement the learning that you were doing in the classroom?
Yeah, so I really agree with what BB said, but also, so the 3 lessons that we created for the BARCC lab were on the history of BLM and Me Too movements, the global context of sexual violence, and then also just rape culture in popular media. And obviously through creating those PowerPoints and those lessons, we really had to embody the knowledge. But the most valuable part of the lab for me was when we presented it, and then we just had discussions with the high school groups who are in such a different community from me and have different perspectives and experiences. And we're very open to talking about and engaging with that knowledge, which I think is really important. Because it's sort of, even though we were having discussions in the classroom, we were in a college setting, it was very different. And so talking with these students on a more casual basis and learning about how they saw the cultural representations or how they had experienced it in their school was really valuable to just make the knowledge more personal, I think.
Great. That reminds me of what Casey was saying about just the leaders that we have, in the city of Boston, right? Young people that are doing this work. Casey, my question for you is a little bit a different take on this, especially given all of the work that you've done with different organizations. And this is something Ted and I talk about a lot, but how can universities be better partners with community organizations like BARCC? What are some of our... In French, we call this une question indiscrète, which is a question you're not supposed to ask, but
that's right. Thank you. I think what I was laughing about is resource sharing is one that comes up. Yes. So, and I'm not just talking about money and about supporting your local rape crisis center, but I'm talking about having really meaningful partnerships with folks like you and with Northeastern and with powerful students who are coming to do work with us. I think there's a lot of reciprocal learning that takes place, and we really benefit from it. We are very committed to building the field and having folks come to us and do share their expertise and share their learning, we're only making the field stronger. And we learn from the evidence base that you all are sharing with us. So I also think, if I'm being honest, that I want campuses to share with us honestly the things that aren't going well and the things that are hard and the barriers and structures and systems that are impeding their work. Because we are partners in programming, right? We don't want to just hear all the good stuff that's going on. We want to be true partners in looking for solutions. And that means both us as an organization and any school we're working with having a real commitment to transparency and honesty, because I think this is such an issue. This issue thrives in the darkness. So the more we can shine a light on it, the actual better job we're going to do at preventing it on campus or off.
Yeah, that's so good. I'm thinking about some conversations I've had with Title IX officers, or even presentations I've been in with Title IX officers, and feeling like what they were telling me didn't line up with what the students were disclosing to me, And I think that that's something that I found really challenging to navigate as an advocate, as someone who sees herself as a survivor advocate and works with so many students. And, was a part of an institution where it did feel like rape culture was kind of proliferating, but that it didn't, that wasn't the message,
Right.
So I think about that a lot. And I think about that in terms of campus culture and what are the different things that allow that kind of culture to flourish, because I've been at different kinds of institutions and yeah, it's difficult. It's very difficult.
I mean, there's an incentive, right, for a built-in incentive for reported numbers of sexual violence to remain low, right? When I look at a school and I see really low numbers, I find that very suspect, right? Because I know it's happening. I know they're just not being reported. And there are lots of reasons why students or staff do not feel comfortable reporting to either the school or to law enforcement. Lots of reasons. When I see higher numbers on campus, higher reported numbers, but I see good policies, good programming, and good partnerships in place, I would be so much more likely to send my own kids there, to recommend that somebody go there, because it means they're actually acknowledging the scope and scale of the problem. And there are actually systems in place that students feel safer using. But that means we have to acknowledge the actual scope and scale of the problem, which is bracing when we look at the numbers. And when we look at, from a Bureau of Justice statistical report, where the number one reason across 33 schools, the number one reason why survivors of sexual violence on campus did not come forward and tell anybody was because they didn't think it was a big enough deal to report. That was one of the, that was the top, it was tied. So I always think about that. What does it say about the culture of a campus, or our culture as a whole, where survivors of sexual violence do not believe what was done with them was a big enough deal to report?
Yeah, that's really disturbing. I remember hearing when I was traveling for a long walk home once, we went to the University of Kentucky, where they have a very robust violence prevention center, and they welcomed us.
Green dot.
Yeah, yep. And the director of the center, I remember hearing her speak one time, and she said, 1 in 5 women on college campuses will be sexually assaulted. 1 in 5 women will be raped, right, on college campuses. She was like, can you imagine if 1 in 5 laptops were stolen? Like, there would be an outrage. People would be like, parents would be calling, like, I'm really concerned about sending my kid to the school. Like, what's happening with the laptops, And that comparison was so, this was like 7 years ago, but the comparison was just so jarring to me. Because, and I think this is what gets back to, the idea of this system, right? Like a heteropatriarchal system that we live under, that in which, the lives of the harmed to whom this is happening in the majority, it's not that they're not valued, right? People's actual lives and bodies themselves are not valued. But we could go down a whole, does anyone want to add to that? Kate or BB, do you have anything to add to this discussion before I ask the next question? I know you have a lot to say, BB, about this.
I really can't put it as eloquently as you both did, but I will speak from experience that college campuses can do better. Like their Title IX programs can definitely do way better. It's almost like they discourage you to report sometimes. So they can do better. And I feel like just sexual assault awareness could take up more space on the campus. I think it needs to take up way more space.
Thank you. What about you, Kate?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with everything that's been saying. I've had friends who have had things happen to them and they, just don't think it's a big enough deal. And I think that's sort of the culture, not only of like Boston College where I'm at currently, but just in America, globally. It's just not seen as violent as other forms of violence, which is fascinating.
A lot of feminist scholars have framed this as, for a long time, it was seen as a crime that occurred in private as opposed to one that occurred in public, right? Which is why there wasn't that much attention. Okay, so my last question is before I invite you to ask questions to each other, I want to know from BB and from Kate, how has your involvement in the movement to end gender-based violence progressed or evolved or changed since your experience in the class?
I could start because I'm still an undergraduate student. So mainly it's progressed just in the classes that I choose to take, but then even in the classes that don't focus on these types of topics, to ask questions about what about these people, like why are we talking about them, the marginalized voices. But then even outside of the classroom with friends and with family where these things aren't really talked about, and just to ask questions and learn from other people, like educate as a community. And then also, just over the summer, I'm doing an internship with Thistle Farms, the organization I mentioned before, and just to work with survivors and make a theme we talked about a lot in the class was that the personal is political. And to make sure those two things, like the classroom and ideas and the actual people, coincide, because I think that's very important.
Thank you. BB?
Yes, I definitely agree. I definitely agree. I think the class gave me, it taught me to look at everything through a radical feminist lens, and to critique and question everything. I joined BARCC as a part of their Survivor Speakers Bureau. So I get the opportunity to speak at different schools, organizations about my experience. And I hope to share my story as a tool to educate people and end rape culture ultimately. I feel like I am a social justice warrior in that sense. And it's an ongoing conversation. I like to bring it up whenever I can.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And that's so important. I think that goes on, with how we started this, when I was talking about summoning our imaginations for the task, and how each of you, I think what often happens with this class is different students learn what their own intervention will look like, and that it might not look the same for everyone. But the goal is for people to do their part, right? To continue this work long after the grades are in and the class is over. Okay, so any of you have questions for each other? This is something I always invite panelists to do, because I feel like we have these conversations, but something might have come up for you that you wanted to ask someone else.
I'm not a panelist, but I have a question.
Yes, please.
The majority of transgressors in this field are hetero men. And I'm curious as to how you involve that cohort of individuals who are perpetuating these criminal acts in the conversation in a way that would reduce the likelihood of these kinds of things happening.
That's a great question. I can start and then I'll let others chime in. So, I will say, like almost all of the classes that I teach, I had a very low percentage comparatively, right? A low percentage of, kind of cisgender straight men take the class. That was especially white, right? I think that maybe Kate, your year, we had more Black male students. And I think actually both years, the majority of the men were always Black, right? And, they were small percentages of class. And this was a rather large class. I mean, we had 80 students, large, at least for the fields that we're teaching in, which is sociology and literature. And this is actually, Ted, something that I struggle with, because I often would feel like, well, am I already preaching to the converted? Because the kind of people that are drawn to the class, right, already are kind of invested in the issue and they want to transform rape culture. And so what I usually do with those men, since they're a captive audience that come to my class, is really encourage them to go out and get 5 of their, bro-ish friends and talk to them about the topic and invite them to the event. So the class always had events. And so, getting them to engage their peers, because they are, they're drinking the Kool-Aid. And so now I'm like, now your responsibility is to share the Kool-Aid with your friends who are never going to talk to me. And I think the same thing, I think, Kate, you heard me say this, I would always be like, go talk to your racist white uncle, right? Like, he's never going to listen to me, but you can talk to him. And so I think that that's kind of the model of change that I really believe works, is by getting a few people who are already invested and then having them reach their circles to create change. I think is the model. What do you think about that though, Casey? Because you also work in this area, I think.
Ooh, we could do a multi-day seminar on this one. It's incredibly difficult. And I believe with, I agree with Dr. Jean-Charles on this about, using that peer relationship or that family relationship to open doors. We do have programs. There are federal grant programs, like out of the Office on Violence Against Women. There's an Engaging Men and Boys and Preventing Violence Against Women and Girls grant program, very gender binary, admittedly. But there are specific programs. In fact, BARCC has one of these where we're using our young people are creating content for online streaming platforms such as Twitch, Discord, and YouTube Live, which skew 95% not male identified, to reach them where they are. A lot of times I think we try and bring people to us. I'm a firm believer that we need to go where they are. But I say this as a white cis man. We need more engagement. Women, trans folks, the LGBTQ community, the women of color have been leading this work for so long, and having to be both, in many cases, the leaders in it and also the ones most impacted by it. And that is so incredibly unfair and unjust. So as part of my work is trying to bring more men, more male identified folks into this work and to take responsibility for, because most sexual violence is perpetrated by men, most men are not perpetrating sexual violence at the interpersonal level. There's some structural stuff, right? There's rape culture stuff going on, but I need to continue to work to bring in more men into this field, not to take over leadership, but to share in the responsibility of finding solutions to ending sexual violence.
Can I jump in with a follow-up question to Casey on that, kind of a historical perspective, maybe on how you have seen the normalization of sexual violence change? I'm thinking especially in more recent times with the normalization of behaviors that previously were not normalized so much as their own kind of movement. And by that, I mean the kind of toxic intersection of white supremacy, misogyny, sexual violence against women, almost as a recruiting tool or as a culture unto itself, that within that culture is being celebrated. And not, perhaps even a right of membership or passage to hold those kind of violent perceptions of, or the perceptions of normalizing violence against women. And I'm wondering if you have seen that changing the dialogue and changing your level of concern about getting white hetero men to take more of a voice against that movement among white hetero men.
That's a great question. And I want to, we have at BARCC, we have a graduate intern who is a graduate student at Suffolk University. Her name is Alexandria Anuoha, and she does, her doctoral research is exactly around this intersection in recruitment of young men in particular, in this intersection of misogynoir and these various right-wing movements. It's always been around. I don't think it's a new phenomena. The tools we have to share and spread hateful and harmful information and disinformation have amplified it, and in my experience, have brought more people in through those avenues. But it's been in existence, but the ability for folks to organize has increased, and we need to make sure that our strategies for disrupting that evolve as well. And there are people doing great work around that, but we need to be as disruptive as we can, and not let, try and stem the tide a little bit. But again, Alexandria Anuoha does some incredible work around this. So I'm always singing her praise.
We touched upon the role of higher education in addressing these issues. At this point, women constitute virtually everywhere a majority of students and increasingly faculty on our campuses. And I wonder how the strength of a feminist movement on campus can help to affect and bring about change in this, in the negative aspects of the culture. I know that when women started to appear in significant numbers on campuses, sometimes there was resentment expressed towards them that then showed up in forms of violence and oppression. But now that women are a majority of our college students, how can that group help to change both the culture on campus and the culture that exists off campus?
So, excuse me, it's so interesting because I'm also in women, gender, and sexuality studies. And I've talked to a few colleagues here, especially as a new person, about, well, how do they feel about the sense of students identifying as feminist on campus? And they said that they feel like the number of feminists on campus is going down. And so that's really fascinating to me and troubling, of course. But, I think it's important to note that the increase of women, female population doesn't necessarily mean that there's an increase in a feminist population that really is committed to these issues or even addressing them, through an intersectional lens. And that sometimes in cases like, I think about Boston College too, where we have some members of our student bodies, some members of that student body that are very conservative and very actually beholden to the ideals of patriarchy that help to prop up rape culture. And that being said, yes, I do think that the creation, I'm like an organizer, activist type. So I believe in creating coalitions is really the key to this. And I think that that's what we got right with this class, because we essentially created an anti-violence, an anti-GBV, I was going to say anti-racist coalition, but no, they're also anti-racist, but we created this coalition of students, right? Just like Kate was saying with her roommate, and, a lot of them went on to go work at the Women's Center. And so they have this cohort and they're working together and traveling through the university together, so that by their senior year, they can, again, going back to that theory of change that I mentioned before, bring along other people. So I think that by, one thing that would be great, and which is one of the reasons why I really want to be able to teach a class like this at Northeastern, is by having, you could create that same kind of movement by starting with first-year students. And then, what does it mean if the students then, like, what if we have co-ops that are with feminist organizations or with organizations working to end gender-based violence like BARCC and other places? And so even when they leave to go do their co-op, they're still doing something that's aligned with creating that change. I think that that would be a really good way to harness that kind of energy and create real change on campus, because, we know institutional change is difficult to come by at all of these places. And we know that marginalized and minoritized people have a history of activism on college campuses that help to implement programs like ethnic studies, Black studies, women, gender, and sexuality studies, right? Even we have a trans studies, now happening. So I think that creation of a critical mass, but that's also a captive audience, because the thing is, I tell these students all the time, it's great to be an activist on campus, but you also need the intellectual part of that active. Like, there's an academic side to activism, right? I've been reading Angela Davis's book, Feminism, Abolition Now. And she talks about how, like, critical resistance, a lot of these prison abolitionist groups, they started as reading groups. People were reading, right? Same thing with feminists, consciousness raising. People were sitting around reading the theory, whether it was Simone de Beauvoir or reading the feminist mystique. And it was out of that came their organizing. So I think that if you could get a group of students for which you see the marriage between the academic intellectual side as well as the organizing side, you could really create some lasting change.
Régine, if I could respond to that, and a big thumbs up to that response, but we were talking about the normalization of rape culture. We need to normalize some alternative thinking and thought about that. And it often strikes me that when movements initiate out of student organizations, it's an amazing and powerful phenomenon. But students are passing through universities, and continuity and succession planning and all of that can be kind of challenging, especially at a university like Northeastern, where students are coming and going to co-op and all these other things. And what strikes me about the power of embodying this in a course is education is the core business of the university. And it is something we as faculty have a lot more longevity and stability. And yes, if we teach first-year students this and they build a cohort that stays together for 4 years, that's phenomenal. And we want to keep that pipeline going. But the continuity of that pipeline can really be underscored by integrating it into the curriculum, not waiting for students who are going to be passing through to carry the burden of that, including the fact that they are in positions of less power on campus than faculty and administrators.
That's absolutely right. How many students do we have? BB and Kate might remember, who would always say, even on the evaluation, this course should be required. It should just be required for all students at the university. And then that would also help to change the culture. And a real course that's in the curriculum, not a training module, not a workshop, not a speaker series, an actual course for credit in the curriculum that is required. I agree with you 100%. I think we're out of time though, right?
Winding down, we absolutely are.
If I could add,
I had one, I'm sorry, go on, Kate.
okay, I just wanted to add one thing very related to what you guys were talking about. I agree a lot. And last semester I took a class called Intro to Feminisms, and there was 2 cis men in it, but it was basically like a community of women. And the academic information was super important, but it was also just, we talked about ways we wanted to see Boston College change. And what Rebecca talked about, which I think was really important, freshmen talked about movements they wanted to change, and seniors gave advice, and seniors talked about movements they were a part of on campus and told it to the freshmen so that change wouldn't end with them and it would keep going. Because our professor talked about students can, cause ruckus for 4 years, but then they're off of the campus. So I think it's really important to form community and make sure that the movement continues.
That's excellent. That's wonderful, Kate. Thank you. I'm so glad you're in that class.
I had one last question about our student bodies, and that is many of our students come from abroad, and often from countries where there are male-dominated authoritarian governments in place that discourage discussion of these kinds of subjects. And you've done some international work around this. I wonder how one goes about engaging with those wider communities, which will often have students who, when they go home, can have an impact on their local cultures and environments. What are the tools one might use to indicate that this is really a human issue and not a national issue or an issue that only affects women?
Well, I think, you know, as a literature scholar, I can tell you, I think that novels, literature really go a long way in helping to bring people along that. Some of these novels, especially that are, you know, centering the lives and the stories of survivors. This is what I wrote about in my first book, actually, and how much that helps to bring someone along to see like, oh, this is really someone being stripped of their humanity. The other thing that I would say is in all international work, I always believe in taking the lead of the people that are native to that country. And there are, you know, I'm grateful to know, you know, feminists that are working internationally on this issue, right? So there are organizations in Haiti, for example, where I do a lot of my work, that are doing this work on the ground, right? There are organizations. In one of the parts of the class, we watch a film about Panzi Hospital in Rwanda, where there was this doctor, of course, now his name is escaping my mind, but this wonderful doctor who was healing women who had fistula, right? And they're, again, also women organizations that are working on the ground there on these issues, the City of Hope in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And so also showing those students like, you might not know this, but did you know that, like, look at this amazing feminist activist that is from where you're from, who is doing this work, right? So even just the exposure of that to students. So that's my two kind of part answer to that. I would love to hear other people's thoughts though, because BB and Kate had to do all those readings.
Yeah, I was going to just talk about how I feel like sometimes in a lot of our classroom, when we discuss these certain topics, it's only in an American context. And so the class gave us so many different opportunities to realize that, like, racism, rape culture, this is not just an American problem, it's a global problem. And so we need to be intersectional, like even in that aspect, in every single aspect. And I think the class and the different readings from so many different authors like definitely made people realize that, and like to think how is my Americanness getting in the way of how I'm looking at the situation.
That's good. Yeah, thank you.
Well, Rebecca, what? Go on.
I'm sorry. To one of the previous questions about how we as students navigate like these conversations and get cisgendered men involved in the conversations. I wanted to say, like, as a student, I think that one, just like making sure they know that this is not a woman's issue, like this is a everybody's issue. And I feel like a lot of people are trying to be politically correct, and they're like, rather they'll be there, they'll be present in the conversation, but they won't want to speak because they don't want to slip up and get canceled. And I think there's definitely value in learning when to like be silent and let other people speak up, because these people need a space, but I also really always encourage them to like, no, speak on this situation. I would love to hear what you have to say. Like, these are one of the times where you can make mistakes and I will correct you, like, so you don't make a mistake out there. And so I think definitely making them realize that, like, I'm pulling them into the conversation, that I want their input, and stuff like that.
Cool. Rebecca, back to you.
Well, an enormous thanks to all of you, Kate, BB, Casey, and Régine. I'm really proud of Open Classroom for hosting this conversation, and so grateful that the recording of this will be in our archives for in perpetuity for other people to watch and learn from your wisdom and the honesty with which you discussed these topics tonight. Also want to thank Hami and Kwai, as always, for being in the background, providing all the technical support we made that makes this look seamless. And also encourage folks to come next week. We are going to be discussing a topic that is closely related to my work, and one that I think people who are interested in every aspect of social change and racial and social justice and anti-oppression should be thinking about, which is who controls the resources that are intended to support the work of social change, and how can we reimagine the distribution of those resources, which are a form of power, in order to provide more equitable balance between the people who control the resources, the people who are doing the work, and most importantly, the communities who are intended to be served by that. So I hope you'll join us for that conversation. We're going to be joined by Lisa Berendt, the Associate Director of the Resource Organizing Project, a group that I'm so excited about. They are very, very, very new. It is an alliance of social movement and liberation organizations in New England who are joining forces to fundraise together, which I think is a really powerful idea, to actually live your social movement values in the way that you were thinking about resource distribution, as well as Aditi Dalakia, who is the Social Justice Philanthropy Fellow at the Social Innovation Forum, as well as a master's student in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. And so it's going to be really exciting to hear two young leaders who are grappling with the notion of resource and power redistribution in the nonprofit sector. So thank you all. Look forward to seeing you next week. And again, thank you to Ted for always navigating us through these important conversations, and to everybody who joined us tonight.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.